sultry wind, smelling of dust and spices, lazily glided along the street of a small town lost somewhere on the outskirts of South Africa. Abeni stood behind the counter of her shop, listlessly flipping through an old, battered book. Her life in these parts seemed the most ordinary. Sometimes tourists came to the city, rare adventurers who believed that the wild landscapes of Africa could reveal the secrets of the world to them. However, this place where Abeni found herself was far from the usual path. There were no adventures or amazing stories here. Just dust, heat, and endless books. Mara Shelves wasn't very popular, but it had its own charm. Narrow shelves lined with cracked folios, and an old gramophone that constantly made a quiet crackle. Few people came here, mostly local old people, to pass the time reading or talking. But among all of them, one stood out. Abeni first noticed him a few weeks ago. A tall, grey-haired man with a bearing that would be envied by people half his age. He rarely spoke, but his gaze, deep and penetrating, always caused her an incomprehensible feeling of anxiety. ABC came almost every day, sat in the corner by the window and read for a long time. He made no attempt to speak to her, but his silence was so intense that it seemed as if he was talking without words. Abeni often glanced at him over her shoulder, studying his profile. A sharp nose, wrinkles resembling deep cracks in the ground, thick silvery eyebrows that gave him a stern look. But most of all, she was fascinated by his age. This was not a simple old man who had long ago left his life behind him. He had a power hidden behind decades of experience. Abasi was not confused or depressed by life. On the contrary, he seemed to be the lord of time, as if the world around him did not touch him. One hot day brought with it a particularly hectic atmosphere. The wind whirled dry leaves and sand in the air, and Anna had a strange premonition. When Abasi entered the shop, she was almost waiting for him to come. His presence no longer seemed like an accident to her. He sat down in his usual place, took a book from the shelf, and immersed himself in reading. Abeni tried to ignore the strange excitement that was spreading through her body, but she felt her fingers tremble involuntarily as she flipped through the pages of her own book. She couldn't concentrate. Her thoughts kept returning to the way he moved, the way he picked up books, the way his fingers touched old pages. It took several agonizing minutes before she decided to do something. Abeni approached Abasi, trying not to look into his eyes, and, as if by accident, put a new book next to him, which she had just received from one of her rare suppliers. He slowly raised his eyes, and Abeni felt his gaze burning through her. She wanted to say something innocent, some simple greeting, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she just stood there silently, feeling his gaze fix her in place. Abasi slowly reached out and touched the cover of the book.
"You like her?"
Abeni finally managed, her voice quieter than she expected. But even those few words seemed desperately brave to her. Abasi nodded, but didn't say a word. He looked back at the pages of his book, and Abeni didn't know if she should leave or stay. Everything was boiling inside her. The air around them seemed to have thickened to an unbearable tension, and his every gesture was like a dull blow to her consciousness. Time dragged on for an excruciatingly long time, and Abeni almost gave up, about to return to the counter, when she suddenly heard his hoarse voice.
"Why are you here?"
Abeni flinched, not expecting him to speak. His voice was low, with a faint accent that made it even more mysterious.
"This is my house,"
she replied, trying to hide the tremor in her voice.
"I found peace here."
He nodded, still looking at her with his penetrating eyes.
"It's amazing how calmness sometimes finds us in the most unexpected places."
His words stuck in her head, but she didn't have time to answer. Abasi returned to reading again, as if their conversation was just a moment, a random spark in an endless sea of time. But this spark, despite its brevity, caused a storm of emotions in Anna. Several days passed, but their next conversation was not long in coming. Once again, Abeni couldn't hide her attraction to this strange, wise man. There was something so inexplicably attractive about him that his every gesture, every word uttered in a low voice, evoked feelings in her that she could not comprehend for a long time. And so when they were alone again, she decided. Abasi was sitting immersed in reading, but this time Abeni came closer, too close. He raised his head and their eyes met. There was no need for words between them at this moment. There was something more than simple attraction in the air. It was like a challenge to everything she knew about herself and about life. Her breathing quickened, and she felt her heart begin to beat faster. Abasi did not look away. His lips twitched and he opened his mouth to say something, but the next moment Abini leaned towards him. She didn't even realize what she was doing until their lips touched. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a powerful, almost brutal collision between two worlds that had been at a distance from each other for too long. His hand touched her neck, and at that moment the whole world around her disappeared. All the books, the heat, the sound of the wind, none of that existed anymore. Just the two of them, trapped in this unbearably passionate and unpredictable relationship. Abasi pulled away first, breathing heavily, but his eyes were still full of the same tension as before.
You have no idea what you're doing,
he said with a grin, his voice hoarse. Abeni nodded silently, because she knew this was just the beginning of something much bigger. It had been several days since their lips had first touched. Abeni couldn't get rid of that memory. It haunted her like a dry African wind that constantly blew in her face, reminding her of the heat that did not fade day or night. He thought about ABC every minute, about his wrinkled hands, about how his fingers barely touched her neck, about how his lips were unexpectedly soft for a man who had passed through so many years of life. He was a mystery that she desperately wanted to solve, but Abasi was in no hurry to take the next step. After that passionate moment in her shop, he disappeared for several days. Abeni tried to convince herself that it was for the best. She even tried to forget him, doing the routine, laying out books, dusting shelves, communicating with rare customers, but none of these actions helped. Her thoughts returned to the one man who seemed to be able to capture her whole heart. Every time the door of her shop creaked softly, Abini found herself turning too fast, hoping it was him. But there was no Abasia. It seemed that his disappearance only increased her attraction. Whenever she closed her eyes, she saw his face. Those deep wrinkles that hid the story of a lifetime, and that piercing gaze that made her tremble. Evening came and Abasi reappeared. He entered quietly, as always, as if he were a shadow that could not be immediately noticed. But Abini sensed his presence even before she saw him. Her heart skipped a beat, and she froze in place, turning her back to him, afraid to meet his gaze so as not to betray her excitement. Abasi walked slowly to his usual place by the window and sat down in an armchair. The same tension that had been hanging between them since the first day hung in the air, but this time it was more tangible, thick and heavy, like a summer thunderstorm about to break out. Abini continued to pretend to be busy, even though her hands were shaking. She couldn't ignore Abasia's presence. Her skin burned as if the air around her was saturated with electricity. She could feel his gaze penetrating her, tearing apart her composure. Finally, unable to bear the tension any longer, Abini took a step towards him. He looked up. That look was like gravity pulling her towards it. Abasi slowly put the book down on his lap, without taking his eyes off it. Abani stopped halfway, not knowing what to say or how to behave. Their relationship became unpredictable and dangerous, like a predator stalking its prey.
You?
Her voice sounded hoarse, as if the words themselves were difficult to pronounce. But there was everything in those words. Her fear, attraction, and curiosity.
I couldn't help it.
He replied as simply as if his return was as inevitable as the sunrise. Those words hit her like a wave, and Abini realized she couldn't resist anymore. Her body moved of its own accord, as if the magnetic force emanating from Abasia was pulling her towards him. She came closer and stood right in front of him, too close, so that she could feel the warmth of his body radiating through the air.
I do not have to,
she whispered, but her voice was so weak that Abasi didn't even seem to hear the words, or he didn't pay attention to them. He was silent, but his gaze said everything. His eyes were the answer to her insecurities, her fears, and her feelings. Abini stared at him, and her legs went with. It was as if she could no longer stand in this place, could no longer be near this man without succumbing to the desire that gripped her. Abasi raised his hand and gently touched her waist, as if giving her one last chance to leave if she wanted to. But Abini didn't move. She could no longer pretend that her feelings for him could be controlled. They were like an avalanche that she couldn't resist. Slowly, almost involuntarily, she knelt down next to his chair and buried her face in his lap. Her hands were shaking, but she allowed herself to succumb to these emotions, venting all her suppressed passion. Abasi did not move. He sat motionless, his fingers barely touching her hair, as if he wasn't sure how to react to it. But at that moment, there was no distance between them anymore. Abini knew that by touching him now, she had crossed a line beyond which there was no going back. This was the moment when she realized that their relationship had become something much bigger than she could have imagined. She raised her head and their eyes met again. Abasi, without taking his eyes off her, gently placed his palm on her face, and Abini felt something break inside her. It wasn't destruction, but rather liberation, as if all her fears and doubts had suddenly dissipated, leaving only one thing: this indomitable attraction that could no longer be ignored.
You know we can't.
He began softly, his voice soft, but at the same time filled with pain.
I know.
Abini interrupted, and her voice was as determined as her actions. She didn't know what lay ahead, but she was sure of one thing: she couldn't run away from what she felt anymore. This man, with his wrinkles and history, with his secret power and wisdom, was her destiny. Abasi slowly got up from the chair and, bending slightly, grabbed her by the waist, lifting her to her feet. They stood face to face, breathing in unison. At that moment, there was nothing but the two of them. There was no past. There was no future, only the present. Their mutual attraction, which could no longer. Abini took a step towards him, her lips trembling with anticipation. Abasi bent down slowly. Their faces were only a few centimeters apart. She could feel his breath on her skin, his warmth. Their lips met again. But this time it was not a casual kiss, but a conscious, passionate collision of two worlds. Everything inside her was on fire, and Abini allowed that fire to engulf her completely. But Abasi kissed her slowly, but with such force that it seemed they were bound to each other forever. Each of his kisses was like a promise that their bond would only grow stronger, despite all the obstacles and the age difference. At that moment, Abini realized that her attraction to Abasi was not just a passion, it was something deeper, stronger. Their attraction became the center of her life, and no matter how hard she tried, she could no longer hide from these feelings. The city, lost in the hot African savanna, was sinking into twilight. Abini sat in her small shop, catching the last rays of the setting sun, which were slowly fading, leaving long shadows in their wake. The threat was heavier than usual that day, but that wasn't what bothered her. She was thinking about the evening ahead. Abasi, his image hadn't left her mind since the moment he'd invited her to dinner. Everything was said so simply, as if it was inevitable, and she agreed without hesitation. However, now that evening was approaching with inexorable certainty, Abani began to feel uneasy. She didn't know what to expect. It seemed that this man was a mystery that she desperately wanted to solve, but was afraid of what she might discover under the cover of his restraint. When the sun finally disappeared below the horizon, Abini closed the shop. She dressed in a light dress that flowed over her figure, seemingly weightlessly. She had chosen it, especially for this evening, not too pretentious, but with elegant lines that emphasized her femininity. Her long hair, usually gathered in a simple ponytail, now fell freely over her shoulders, touching her skin with an ease that her thoughts lacked. Abasi was waiting for her at the entrance to the shop. His usual calm demeanor, restraint and confidence did not leave her alone. Abeni came out to him, holding back a slight tremor in her hands. He didn't say a word, just motioned for her to take his arm. She obeyed, as if everything had been decided for her in advance. They walked through the deserted streets of the city, drowning in the quiet noise of the evening wind. Their footsteps were unhurried, and neither of them was in a hurry to break the silence. This moment seemed frozen in time. The very space between them seemed to vibrate with tension, but no one wanted to take the first step to destroy this fragile harmony. Abini looked at Abasia out of the corner of her eye. His face, illuminated by the soft light of the street lamps, seemed even more mysterious this evening. The deep wrinkles on his forehead and around his eyes gave him the appearance of a man who had seen more than she could imagine. His hair, silvery with age, shimmered in the night light, as if reflecting the light of the stars that were just beginning to appear in the dark sky. They walked for a long time in silence. It seemed that Abasi knew this city like the back of his hand. Finally, they came to a restaurant hidden among the narrow streets. This place was known only to locals. Tourists never found it, even by accident. The restaurant was old, with wrought iron gates and high walls covered with creeping plants. As they entered, Abini smelled exotic spices mixed with the scent of flowers that hung in the air. Abi chose a table for them in the corner, in the very shade, away from the rare visitors. Abini sat down opposite him, feeling her excitement increase. Everything inside her was boiling like a seething cauldron of emotions. But Abasi seemed to remain just as calm and balanced. They ordered, and while they were waiting for the food, Abeni tried to speak.
This is the place. Do you come here often?
Her voice was trembling, although she tried to speak as confidently as possible. Abasi looked at her with his deep, penetrating eyes, which always seemed to see more than they needed to.
Rarely,
He replied shortly, but there was no tension or hesitation in his voice. He spoke calmly, as if he knew the answer to all her questions even before she asked them. Then silence fell between them again, but it wasn't the silence that weighed on them. It was a silence in which energy was hidden. With every second they spent together, this energy only intensified. Abeni felt her heart begin to beat faster, although she did not understand why. There was something inexplicably attractive about this man, something that pulled her out of the familiar world and threw her into the unknown. When the food arrived, Abasi began to eat slowly, consciously savoring every bite. Abini, on the other hand, hardly touched her plate. She couldn't focus on the food. Her mind was full of him. His every gesture, every look raised a wave of excitement in her chest. They didn't talk much. Talking would be unnecessary, but every moment was filled with meaning. Abaja's every move, his every look were like answers to her unspoken questions. And although Abini was used to noise, to words, to explanations, now it seemed to her that silence revealed much more than any conversation could. After dinner, they went for a walk again. Abasi suggested a walk along the river, where the water murmured softly, reflecting the light of the moon. Abeni agreed, although there was still a slight fear in her heart. She didn't know where this evening was leading them, but she couldn't resist. Abasi walked beside her, his arm wrapped around her waist again, but this time there was something more to the gesture. It was like an attraction that was impossible to escape from. The water in the river shimmered in the night light, and the sound of its flow was soothing. But this peace was only superficial, because a storm was raging in Anna's soul. They stopped at the water's edge. Abasi was standing next to her, their hands touching. But there was no need for words. Everything has already been said silently. Abini couldn't stand it first. She turned to face him and took a step forward. Her heart was beating so hard that she was afraid he would hear it. Abasi stood motionless, looking at her with his deep eyes. At that moment, everything disappeared. The moon, the river, the trees, all this ceased to exist. Only the two of them remained, their tense bodies and the invincible attraction that bound them. Abini raised her hand and gently touched his face. Her fingers slid over his cheek, feeling the roughness of his skin, the wrinkles, the years he had lived. Abasi closed his eyes for a moment, as if enjoying the touch, and when he opened them again, his gaze was even more intense than before. They stood like that for a few seconds, which seemed like an eternity. Abeni felt her body tremble with tension. She couldn't hold back any longer. She pulled him to her, and their faces were inches apart. Her breathing quickened, and she felt her lips tremble with anticipation.
I do not know what we are doing.
She whispered, but Abasi did not answer. He just leaned closer, and their lips met again in a kiss. This kiss was not like the first time. It wasn't just a touch of lips. It was an explosion of emotions that they had been holding back for so long. Abasi kissed her slowly, deeply, as if each kiss was a promise of something more. His arms wrapped around her waist, pulling her closer to him, and Abini felt her legs weaken. It seemed to her that the ground was slipping away from under her feet, that she could no longer stand still. Abasi pulled away first, but his hands were still on her waist. They were breathing heavily, as if this kiss had taken away all their energy. Abini looked into his eyes, trying to find answers to her questions there, but she saw only one thing: desire, which overlapped everything else. African nights always seemed to Anna to be the hottest. During the day, the sun mercilessly scorched the city, leaving it under its unbearable weight. But when night fell, the heat did not go away. It just became different. She became inner, hiding under the skin like an irresistible desire, like a melting passion that could not be ignored. After their first date with Abasis, everything changed. They could no longer hide behind the mask of casual encounters in the shop. Their attraction has become too obvious, too strong to go unnoticed. And although every time Abeni met his gaze, her heart began to beat faster, they both knew that this must remain a secret. Every night, Abeni felt trapped in her own thoughts. She lay down on the bed, naked in the light of the moon, which flooded the room through the half-open window. The wind brought with it the scents of night flowers and the dust of the savannah. But this wind did not bring relief. He, like everything around him, was filled with that hidden energy that now permeated her every day. She knew that Abasi was waiting for her. Their meetings were always unannounced, spontaneous, but they seemed to feel each other at a distance. When Abini closed her eyes, she could see his face. She could feel his arms around her waist, his lips touching her skin. But it wasn't just a memory. It was a premonition that was growing with every second, like a growing thunderstorm in the distant mountains. And then one day, when night fell on the city again, Abinai, unable to fight this attraction anymore, left the house. She didn't think where she was going. Her feet knew the way better than she did. She crossed the narrow streets of the city, where rare passers-by hid in the shadows of buildings. Her steps were fast and determined, but inside she was seething with desire, fear and passion. Abasi was waiting for her on the outskirts of the city, where a narrow path led into the savannah, to the hills overlooking the city. Their secret meetings were always held away from human eyes. There, in the wild where there were no houses, no streets, only earth and sky, they could be themselves. Abini saw his figure from afar. His silhouette stood out against the background of the bright horizon, where the last glimmer of the day had not yet completely faded. Abasi stood motionless. His body seemed to blend into the landscape. He didn't move, didn't hurry to meet her, but her heart still jumped in her chest as she approached. He didn't take a step to get to her first. There was no need. There was no more distance between them, even if they were standing a meter apart. When Abeni stopped next to him, she felt her body begin to tremble with tension. Abasi did not touch her, but his presence, as before, was overwhelming. His silence was filled as well as the air around them, which seemed heavy from the heat of the night. Abini slowly raised her hand and ran her fingers over his shoulder. She could feel his skin burning under her touch, despite the cool wind blowing from the hills. Abasi did not move, but she knew that he felt her touch as keenly as she felt his. They stood in silence until the savour beanie around them was drowned in the night. All of nature seemed to be holding its breath, as if the earth itself was waiting for the inevitable to happen. Beanie slowly snuggled closer to him, feeling his warmth envelop her like an unbreakable thread connecting them. Abasi finally wrapped his arms around her, pulling her towards him as if it was the most natural action in the world. They merged into a single whole under the open sky, where billions of stars spread above them. Their bodies moved in unison, as if they had known this dance for a long time. Every breath, every gesture was filled with silent understanding. There was no need for words, because their attraction had long since said everything that needed to be said. Each meeting was like a ritual, an inevitable part of their existence. They found each other at night, far from prying eyes, and whenever their bodies met, the world around them ceased to exist. Just the two of them, just their passion, their irresistible desire. No one knew what was going on between them. Their meetings were hidden not only from prying eyes, but also from the light of day. Every time morning came, Abini returned to her house as if nothing had happened, but her thoughts stayed with him. Her body still remembered his touch, like a fire that could not be extinguished. Abasi never talked about the future. He made no plans, offered her nothing but the present moment. But it was enough. Abini knew that every night, when she went back along the path leading to the hills, he would be waiting for her there, as before, and she couldn't turn down this opportunity. She couldn't fight this attraction no matter how hard she tried. Savabini seemed to know about their secret. She took them in her arms, covering them under the stars like an invisible veil. Every night they got lost in its vastness, inhaling the smell of dry grass and listening to the rustle of the wind. And in this simple but insanely passionate world, they found what they could not find in ordinary life. Time passed slowly, but it didn't matter. With each new date, their bond became deeper and stronger. Abini felt that her life was now divided into two parts. The one that was during the day, when she performed her duties, and the one that was at night, when she gave herself entirely to a passion that she could no longer control. Every morning, when she returned home, her body was still burning from meetings with Abasis. She tried to forget, but the memories of his hands, of his lips, of how they merged into one, stayed with her longer than she could have wished. These meetings became her life, her secret, her meaning. They never talked about the future. Abasi remained a mystery to her, which she could not solve to the end. But maybe it didn't matter. Their secret meetings became more than just an affair for her. It was her escape from reality, her opportunity to feel alive. Abini knew that one day it could all end, that their connection, like everything else, could disappear as suddenly as it appeared. But until that moment came, she was ready to give herself to this passion every night, over and over again, getting lost in the arms of Abasia and forgetting about everything except their secret world, hidden from everyone else. And in this endless African night where the stars seemed endless, Abini realized that she could not live any other way. The sun was beating down mercilessly again, flooding the streets of the city with endless heat, and Abini felt the weight of these days begin to weigh on her more than ever before. There were two parallel dimensions in her world, one filled with passion and mystery, something she shared only with Abasis, and the other a reality that seemed to refuse to accept their connection. This reality has become unbearably difficult for her. Every morning, after night meetings, she returned to her house and then went to work, trying to lead a normal life. But it turned out to be impossible. The looks that had seemed indifferent before were now turning into bewilderment and even condemnation. People in a small town have always known everything about each other, and although no one had yet told her directly that they noticed her connection with Abasis, Abini felt that their secret could no longer be kept. She had noticed that visitors to her shop had been staring longer than usual. Their eyes, previously filled only with books and thoughts, now seemed to be trying to unravel her secret. The whispers behind her, quiet but cutting, became an integral part of her daily life. Every time she walked down the street, it seemed to her that people were watching her, as if trying to guess what was going on between her and this mysterious elderly man who was seen next to her. Abeni felt her world slowly narrowing. What used to be simple and understandable has become confusing and stressful. She found herself thinking that her body was beginning to respond to this pressure. The nights were becoming restless. Her sleep was intermittent and shallow. She could no longer quietly enjoy their secret meetings with Abasis, knowing that the shadows of the surrounding society were reaching out to them, trying to destroy what they had built. Sometimes, sitting alone in her shop, Abini mentally replayed the moments when everything was simpler, when their meetings had not yet seemed to her like a struggle with the whole world. Then her heart was beating harder, not from fear, but from anticipation of meeting with Abasis. Now, each of their meetings was filled with a new feeling, the fear of being discovered. But despite this, her passion did not fade. She felt even more attracted to him, as if every challenge only inflamed her feelings. Every morning after the secret meeting, Abini could no longer afford to stroll serenely through the streets of the city. She caught the glances of her neighbors, who looked at her with suspicion and hidden distrust. The local women with whom she used to share ordinary conversations about business and the weather now avoided her, and men sometimes cast at her gazes full of restrained interest, which seemed to her almost obscene. But the worst part was the realization that this hidden world could not exist forever. Abini knew that someday someone would find out the truth. This small town was too small for their secret connection to go unnoticed forever. Every time she saw Abasia on the street or in her shop, her heart began to beat faster, not only from passion, but also from fear. The fear of ruining your life, of being thrown out of this society, of becoming someone who will be pointed at. She often thought of the few who dared to break the unspoken rules of a small town. Such people quickly became outcasts. And now, though silently, she was beginning to realize that she might be in their place. It weighed on her like a huge weight that was getting heavier day by day. One morning, when the sun was just beginning to warm up the sandy streets, Ebony felt a special tension in the air. She opened her shop as usual, but something has changed inside her. Her anxiety had reached its peak. She looked at the passers-by, who seemed to already know what she was so desperately trying to hide. Her mind couldn't get rid of the images of their condemning eyes. They were everywhere, around every corner, behind every door. Ebony felt the ground begin to shake under her feet. Every step she took seemed heavy and strained. Her hands were shaking as she picked up the books. She could no longer work calmly. She could not concentrate on her business. All her attention was now focused on the fear of being exposed. Her life has become an ongoing struggle between her inner desires and outer expectations. She spent every day worrying that someone might see her with a basis, that someone might tell others about. This silence and the hidden tension between her and those around her became unbearable. In moments of solitude, sitting at the counter of her shop or walking through the deserted streets in the evening, Ebony reflected on how she got here. How her life, until recently simple and predictable, turned out to be in such a whirlwind of passion and fear. But she couldn't imagine any other way. Every time she thought about Ebasi, her heart would fill with warmth again, and this inner fire was the only thing that kept her from breaking under the pressure. And yet she knew that no matter what happened, her life would never be the same. Even if she tries to break this connection, society will not forget. Even if she decides to leave, people will remember her secret, even if they didn't find out. Her pressure, which was getting stronger every day, threatened to destroy not only her connection with Oasis, but also herself. She tried not to think about what her family would say. She had already begun to avoid meeting her friends, the few people she had once been close to. Her fear of their condemnation was too great. She didn't want to explain to them what she didn't fully understand herself. This connection with Oasis was more than just a passion for her, but how to explain it to those who did not feel the same? Ebony continued to live on the edge. Every day she balanced between desire and fear, between passion and condemnation, and although her inner world was torn apart, she knew one thing: Ebasi was the only one who gave her a sense of life, and for this she was ready to continue her struggle, despite all the difficulties. So she went forward, step by step, despite all that she had to endure. Ebony stood on the edge of the cliff, looking down at the silent savanna that spread out in front of her. The African land lay beneath her like a giant carpet of tawny sand, grasses and sparse trees, stretching all the way to the horizon, where the evening sun was dimming. Up here, the wind blew across her face, cooling her hot cheeks, but the fire was still boiling inside her. Passion, struggle, fear, everything was mixed up like a wild hurricane that seemed to tear her apart from the inside. She knew that Ebasi was waiting for her at the bottom of the hill. He was always there, like an inevitable shadow, and at the same time, as someone who remained incomprehensible and mysterious until the very end. His presence did not comfort her, did not provide answers. It only increased her confusion. All this mystery, all this passion that bound them together, now stood in front of her as a fork in a life path that could no longer be ignored. Every night when they met on the outskirts of the city, amid the sounds of the wild and the whisper of the night wind, Ebony felt her life boil up. But every morning brought her back to reality, where there was no place for their connection. The social pressure, the condemnation of people, those hidden glances and whispers behind her back, all this gradually destroyed her calmness. The city that had once been a refuge for her was now a cage that pulled her deeper and deeper. She hadn't come here today to meet Oasis again. This time she was looking for an answer. Her soul was filled with questions that she asked herself over and over again. What's next? How long will she be able to continue living in two worlds, where in one, Ebasi, passion and night secrets, and in the other, reality which presses and does not allow breathing? She took a step forward, feeling the wind getting stronger, ruffling her hair, as if trying to keep her from jumping into the abyss. But this was not the step that leads to the edge. It was a step towards a choice she knew she had to make. Her thoughts revolved around one thing. Could she continue to live as before, torn between passion and condemnation? Or is it time for her to stop these painful night meetings and try to return to the life she led before Abijah? But how can you forget something that has changed you forever? Her memories of him were too vivid to be erased. Every touch of Abijah left a mark on her body, like an imprint that could not be erased. Abeni remembered how his arms wrapped around her at night, how his lips found her in the dark. These moments were full of passion and pain at the same time, the pain of realizing that they belong only to the night, only to this hidden world where no one saw them and did not condemn them. But the sun was almost down, and reality was approaching with it. Abeni knew that Abasi was waiting for her downstairs, as always. But what if she doesn't come down? What if she just walked away, leaving him waiting? This thought flashed through her mind for a moment, but even it did not bring relief. She understood that their bond was too strong to disappear so easily. She took another step, and her foot was on the edge of the cliff. Savabini stretched below, wild, boundless, as uncontrollable as her own feelings. Abeni looked at the horizon, where the last rays of the sun barely touched the ground, and realized that no matter how hard she tried, she would not be able to completely escape from this passion. But could she accept it? She remembered those rare moments when she returned home after their meetings and felt her heart being torn apart. This struggle with herself, with what was right and what was wrong, tormented her. Abasi was more than just a man to her. He was her release and her punishment at the same time. She was alive with him, but every day this life became more and more like an endless battle. Abeni moved away from the edge and sat down on a rock. The wind had died down, and night was gradually covering the savannah. She knew she was facing a choice that couldn't be right or wrong. Whichever path she chooses, it will always be accompanied by pain. If she stays with Abasis, her life will turn into an eternal struggle with society, with herself. If she leaves, she will lose something that gave her life meaning. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, trying to find some peace in herself. But her thoughts were too chaotic to find peace. All she saw in front of her was Abijah, his face, his wrinkles, his eyes, which saw her as she could not be for others. He understood her. He was the one who opened up a world for her that she hadn't known before, and yet she understood that their path together could not be simple. It was a path filled with struggle, condemnation, and fear. Could she sacrifice everything for this passion, or should she have chosen another path? The path of solitude and tranquility, but without the inner fiery element that Abasi kindled in her. The night completely covered the savannah, and the moon slowly rose into the sky, flooding the earth with its cold light. Abeni stood up again. The wind picked up again, as if nature itself was pushing her to a decision. She looked down to where Abasi was waiting for her, and realized that the answer had been inside her all this time. But even now, when the decision was made, she did not know what her future would look like. She took a step forward, but this time not to the edge of the cliff. Her feet carried her back along the path she had come here. She walked slowly but confidently, every movement imbued with the weight of the choice she had made. She didn't know what was waiting for her next. She didn't know if she would stay with Abasis or go the other way. But one thing was clear. Her life would never be the same again. Every step she took now was filled with a new meaning, a new power. She didn't look back, didn't try to figure out what she was leaving behind. All that mattered was that she was moving forward, and no matter what happened, her life would be her own. At the bottom of the hill, Abasi stood waiting. Savannah didn't care about their passions, but it was on this land, under the light of African stars, that a story unfolded that could end at any moment. But perhaps it would never end.